All right, we are live. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, we've been, I was just in Orange County about an hour ago. We are streaming live from San Diego here
You
at...
must have flown down here.
Yeah, so shout out to all of my Success Path students that are out there, especially the ones that are in the current sessions right now. I just left you literally an hour and a few minutes ago. So needless to say, we're rushing, so we apologize for starting a little bit late. But it's really important content that we want to go over with you today. And so we're excited to be here for you. You're also notice that we're missing one of the three musketeers is missing. And that is
the best looking one of our entire group.
That's right. The person who normally makes this actually look pretty good is missing. She's out doing her lawyer thing somewhere out there, defending all of you, and could not be with us today. So she sends her apologies and asks that you excuse her for today. But we'll dive right into this, okay? So, all right, here we go. So today's topic is all about the ongoing debate of the termite and the RPA, and we seem to constantly be having those types of discussions. So that's going to be the primary conversation that we will get in today. But before we get into that, we wanted to share some information with you regarding one of the most recent changes in the RPA, which is the agency confirmation. And Sid, if we can go full screen on that, just so people can see that. So on that first page of your RPA, you're all aware now that there is a change to section 2B in the agency confirmation, right? And so I think there's some confusion on this, on how
Definitely.
to properly fill that out a little bit. So hopefully in the next 5 minutes, we'll be able to clear all that up for you, okay? So Dean, you want to talk to about this? So on this first page that we have here, what you see on your screen, or what they see on their screen, Dean, is the first one is if they're just representing the buyer, how should they fill this out?
Right. When you think about agency, there's two parts to agency, right? So there's the actual disclosure where we will give our customer a copy of the agency disclosure. They just acknowledge that they've received it. And then the second part of that is then we have to confirm agency in the contract so that people know who we're going to actually represent moving forward. So in this first example, we talked about an agreement where we are representing the buyer only. Okay, so we have a listing company, and the change in the agency confirmation on the page 1 of the RPA, it went from having agency just represented by the brokerage. So they just talked about agency in brokerage terms. Now they've simplified it a little bit, so they mention the brokerage, but then they also mention the agent in particular. So when we're representing the buyer exclusively, we fill in the listing agency and their license number, and we fill in the listing agent and their license number. So you can pull that information right off of the listing itself. This may take a little bit more effort than what we've been used to. We just needed to know the company before. Now we need to know the company and the actual agent that's working on the transaction. So as we're representing the buyer, we would write in Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, California Properties, and that will autofill our license number, 013173331. And then on the next line, they ask for the agent themselves. So now if I'm representing the buyer, I'm going to put Dean Stalter, and I'm going to put my personal license number on that line to the right. So it's very clear to the consumer who I'm representing in the transaction.
Okay, so that is if you're just representing the buyer. And so what we're going to do is we're going to now look if you are representing both the buyer and the seller, how that section should look or how you should fill that out. So Sydney, we can go to that next section. You'll see there that it's relatively the same. The only difference is you do have to put in both of those sections Berkshire Hathaway Home Services California Properties. And yes, we do prefer that you type it completely out and not use any abbreviations. And then, of course, putting your name as the seller's agent and both as the buyer's agent, and then checking the box both buyer and seller. Okay, so that's just as you see it on the screen there, is how we would like you to fill that out, right, Dean?
Right, and once you do type that into the RPA and zip forms, it'll autofill everything from there on out. So you just have to do it one time, and then it'll carry through your agreement.
Yep. And so the next scenario is where it's dual agency, but different agents. And so as a reminder, dual agency is any time that this gentleman is representing both buyer and seller. So we all know that ultimately, Dean represents all of our buyers and sellers. We are all sub-agents of Dean. Even if we're broker associates, we're sub-brokers of Dean the broker, right? And so anytime any of us are representing a buyer or a seller, and then we collaborate with one of our colleagues who also reports to Dean, that is going to be considered a dual agency. Okay, and so on that example that you see there on the screen is if you were working with another one of your colleagues, either in your own branch or some other Berkshire Hathaway Home Services California Properties company where Dean is the broker of record. Because there are some sub-franchisees of California Properties where Dean is not the broker of record.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, so
I think that is confusing. There's other companies in the state of California that have our exact name, Berkshire Hathaway Home Services California Properties, but they have different ownership groups and they have a different broker of record. So broker of record is really the differentiator for dual agency.
Yep. Okay, so that's good. I want to encourage everybody, I want to let everybody know that we are taking questions. There should be a chat box somewhere on your screen there, and the wonderful Sydney Masaki is behind the controls today and will read off those questions. So if you have any questions or comments, we'll certainly do our best to answer those live on the show. Sid, do we have any questions on confirmation or agency at all? Okay, good. All right.
One other point I just will throw out here is, when you're getting an offer from an outside agency and you're talking to that agent, just share with them your license number and your broker's license number. Make it a little bit easier for them to fill out their RPA correctly, and then you don't have to deal with it in some kind of a counteroffer or another confirmation.
Yep. Okay. Very good. All right. So we're going to move on now to the topic at hand, and it's regarding termites, right? So we've got a big caution sign up there that says caution. Termites may be present, all right? So let me give you a little bit of background before we actually get into this for the benefit of maybe some newer agents or some people who would like a little bit more context as to why we're having this conversation, okay? So for many, many years, having termite as part of the negotiation process was a standard that we all used. In fact, it was in the purchase agreement where we would identify who is paying for the report and then who is going to pay for subsequent work that report called out. Right? And in fact, there was a form that was even developed called the WPA. I don't even remember what that stands for.
That kind of came in, that wood destroying pest, I guess, was
addendum. Yes, it was
idea.
a wood destroying pest addendum. And that addendum would go deeper into the scope, who's paying for what.
Yeah, it actually was kind of a stopgap measure because originally it was built into the RPA. Then they took it out. Then they offered the WPA as a way to deal with the termite issue because it was causing so much confusion. And then we've kind of come to where we are today.
Yes, and so one of the biggest problems that existed not only with our company but with many other companies was that sellers were being obligated through the negotiation process to commit to repairs that often they had no intention of doing, because either they did not get a termite report or an inspection before they listed it or before they received a buyer, and the buyer would request an inspection, and then the seller would subsequently agree to correct anything that came out in that inspection. And because those negotiations happened up front and at the time that they were negotiating price and all other terms, the seller then would be obligated to correct all termites, whatever showed up. And sometimes we were talking about a lot of money.
Yeah, that's really what got us into trouble, Sam, because as listing agents, we were allowing our sellers to sign a contract where they had made the agreement to clear everything in Section 1, whatever it was. And in a lot of cases, they didn't even have a report to go by. They were contractually obligating themselves to do that work. So we'd get an inspection report that came up with $50,000 worth of work, and it was a major problem. So that was also an impetus to get it out of the RPA, at least the way we had known it.
Yeah, and so, a bunch of attorneys throughout the state of California, primarily those that work at large brokerages like Berkshire Hathaway, and many others, along with the committee, the Forms Committee at the California Association of Realtors, all got together because this was becoming quite a problem. And they came together and were discussing ways that we can minimize risk, because this is really what it's all about, is minimizing risk both for the brokerage and, of course, in turn for our clients, and making this a much more straightforward process. So first I'm going to show you what we typically see on many files that come through today.
Can I just chip in one more thing, Sam? You know, there's a number of costs associated in the RPA that were just customary to our particular region. In Northern California, they handled termite completely different. They did it outside of the agreement. But in Southern California, it was custom that we would provide a termite clearance at the close of escrow. So there are other charges in that agreement today that still remain that are strictly by custom. They're not by law or statute. It's just been our practice.
Well, one of the things that I learned in researching, doing more research for our topic today, was that in many regions in Northern California, yes, that was the case. But in speaking with some title officers and specifically escrow officers who are really in the thick of this all the time. So if I have any escrow officers watching, big shout out to you, because you are always working so hard for everybody. And I know that this is really an important topic for all of you. So hopefully this is helping. Yes. So Northern California, believe it or not, had these issues as well, is what I've learned. So this has been really a statewide initiative that people are trying to manage in terms of risk. All right, so Sid, let's show them what we typically see on contracts that come through. So this is the RPA Section 7. So this is on page 2, and we often will see on 7A2 or 7A3 where you write in the seller to pay for termite inspection report in Section 1 clearance, right? And then identify a particular company. And so when we see this, we know that the agent has probably been around for a while because this is
old habits die hard.
Old habits die hard for sure. And or you learn from somebody who has a lot of experience, and this is how it was done, so frequently. And so what we're really asking you is to no longer do this, right? In fact, if you're taking notes, like somewhere really big, just say, this is not the way we do it moving forward. If you feel like both the buyer and sellers have to put this into the contract, we actually have a better way for you to do that, and we'll show you a little bit later in the slides how to do that. So if we can at least all agree to not in 7A2 put in termite report and Section 1 clearance all on one line, just we'll get to why, and we'll give you some background on that. But this is not the best practice moving forward. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, when they redid the RPA several iterations back, they changed the language on it, and this is really not the appropriate place to address this issue. I compliment you if you're thinking about a termite clearance for your buyer, because I think that's very important. It's a very important inspection, but you just need to handle it in the right order.
Yes. And so many people have, many agents, many experienced, really great agents have a little bit of heartburn over this because, you really understand that termite can be, quite a big deal for some of these homes, and it could translate into quite a big problem for a new buyer who buys a home and there's just riddled with termites, right? So we get it. So I want to bring your attention to the RPA Section 12, because it did not get removed. The whole termite language and the buyer's ability to inspect for termites was not completely removed out of the contract. In fact, again, doing research and preparing again for this conversation, Dean, I was able to go back and look at a lot of the blogs and the forums. And so when all this was happening around 2014, 2015, there was a lot of chatter out in the internet world where people were complaining about this change and this remove, right?
Yeah, it was a big change.
It was a big change, and it was a big deal then. One thing I noticed was how many of these negative articles actually appeared on termite companies' websites, right? On termite company blogs and forums, and somebody representing a termite company, right? So
yeah, they didn't like that change
They
either.
didn't like the change at all, right? Because when something is so customary and ingrained in what we do, it becomes just kind of second nature, right? And the biggest beneficiary of that custom that we had was, in fact, termite companies, right? And so, a lot of the negative feedback that began flowing out there was really sourced back to termite companies, right? And so I'm not trying to badmouth any termite companies or anything like that. I think if any of us were facing a dent in our livelihoods, we would fight tooth and nail as well.
You betcha.
But at the end of the day, this is about protecting buyers and sellers and doing our best job to do that. So I want to bring your attention to RPA Section 12, right? And in RPA Section 12, and if we can go to the actual language, Sid, it actually, one more back, there you go. The language is actually really clear in here, and if you'll just bear with me for just a second, it gives you the language at the top of paragraph 12. It says, within the time specified in paragraph 14b1, buyers shall have the right, at buyer's expense unless otherwise agreed, to conduct inspections, investigations, tests, surveys, and other studies, otherwise known as buyer's inspections, including but not limited to, and then of course general physical inspection was the first thing that they put there, which we all know is really important.
Paramount, you bet.
I would argue even more important than a termite inspection.
I would agree.
And then it goes right into termite, right? And it says, an inspection specifically for wood-destroying pests and organisms. Any inspection for wood-destroying pests and organisms shall be prepared by a registered structural pest control company, shall cover the main building and the attached structures, may cover detached structures, shall not include water test of shower pans and upper level units unless the owner of the property below the shower's consent, shall not include roof coverings, and if the property is a unit in a condominium or other common interest subdivision, the inspection shall include only the separate interests of any exclusive use area being transferred, and shall not include areas and common areas, and shall include a report, and here it is, and it should be highlighted there on your screen. It's pest control report showing the findings of the company, which shall be separated into sections for evident infestation or infections, otherwise known as Section 1, and for conditions likely to lead to infestation or infection, Section 2, right?
Perfect.
So all of this was in the WPA.
Yeah. If that language looks familiar to everyone, that's because they almost lifted it exactly out of that form and put it back into the RPA.
Yeah. So this is that section informing the buyer and the agents involved that the buyer has the right to be able to do this, right? And so, the language is still in there, and nobody is trying to hide anything from a buyer or not encourage a buyer to do these inspections, but rather just making sure that we're appropriately making it a buyer option rather than a seller obligation, right? Which is the way that the previous custom was handled, right? And so as we were doing this research and as we're constantly meeting the legal team and myself, and as we look at issues that come about, we asked, you can't help but ask the question, so what is so special about termites, right? Like, why for so long was termite one of those inspections or one of those reports that we wanted to handle and negotiate upfront, right? And so on your screen there, we asked ourselves, there are other important inspections like the general home inspection, mold and fungus, right? Radon in some areas, soil testing, sewer lines, lead-based paint, asbestos, rats, right? Rodents and mice and all of these things. And yet, so when we ask the question, what makes termites so special, I don't know that we all have an answer for that, right? Why is it that termite, we feel the need to have the seller be obligated to termite and not obligated to mold inspection, for example, right? Yeah. So it was an interesting conversation that I think we all had, and like all of you, like many of you that have been around for a long time, we had a little bit of reservations when this first came out.
Yeah. Well, and you think about the origins of the RPA, back then they didn't even think about mold. It wasn't an issue. We were just beginning to hear about asbestos as a possible issue. So some of these things, as they've evolved, we've realized their importance, and so they've been incorporated into our agreements.
Absolutely. So for those of you that still have a hard time kind of wrapping your head around this, think about that thought. Like, why wouldn't we ask the seller to conduct a mold inspection if we have evidence of mold, right? Why wouldn't we ask them to make sure that there are no rodents around, or things that we can't see, like radon gas, right? Maybe even asbestos, right? How do we mitigate for that if we really don't know the existence of it? Like many of us don't know the existence of termite, right? Yeah. So that's a thought for you.
Yeah, and I was thinking too that on the 11th page of the RPA is the Buyer's Inspection Advisory. And when you think about it, consumers are not in this situation very often. We deal with it every day, so we have certain knowledge and expectations, but a consumer comes into this and for the most part they really don't know what to look for. So that's why I think it's definitely worth some effort to get them to go through that buyer advisory so that they can get an idea what kind of things they might face in a purchase and what kind of things they should incorporate.
Now, all of these inspections are important, including termite.
Absolutely.
They're all important. And so the thought process or the consultation that we would like you to have moving forward is, if a seller has done a termite inspection in advance, they're obviously going to give that to you, and that's terrific, right? And that gives you a good idea as to what might be present there or whatever those findings were. But I guess the bigger question is do we just have the buyer accept whatever that report says? Or really is it a better practice to have that buyer conduct their own inspection through a provider of their choice, right? Because let's be honest here, right?
Yeah, let's have one.
Let's have one, right? So, most termite companies go out and solicit business from listing agents, right? Because they know historically we will, we always pulled a termite report. And so that was an easy source for business for them, right?
And they know that if we get a termite inspection report that we're obligated to share that with the buyer.
Absolutely. And so in order to, continue that business relationship, there are many times where an inspection or a termite company, may find some things that that may be borderline and choose not to disclose it, may choose to disclose it or not. Now, I understand that they have their own license on the line and they're obligated to the state, but the question really is if you're representing the buyer, is it in the buyer's best interest to just simply accept that report and not conduct any inspections themselves? I would argue that it's not.
Yeah, I think they need to realize that even though they're being provided a report, that they're under no obligation to accept it, that they're entitled to get their own reports from people that they trust.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, Dean, but I have seen multiple times on files where there was 2 and 3 different termite reports, and they're widely different.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And it's that seller looking for that one termite report that's going to come in clear.
Exactly, exactly. So I think it's important, much like all of the other reports in here, there are many sellers that are beginning to provide general property inspections where they're doing a pre-sale inspection themselves, which I think is a terrific process, something new that a lot of people in Southern California are doing. In Northern California, they seem to do this on a regular basis. But you would, and if the seller hands over an inspection report, either one that they did or from a previous transaction, I don't think that any of us would ever advise a buyer to just accept what they read there, but rather conduct yet another inspection to make sure that things are the way they were written there, right? If a buyer's hiring an inspector and giving them money, that inspector has that fiduciary responsibility to your buyer, right?
And when we represent a buyer exclusively, our fiduciary duty is to the buyer. So we should be recommending these reports and letting them make the decision.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And the other thing, Sam, I was thinking about, as the market has changed and we've come out of a very strong seller's market where it was really difficult for a buyer to negotiate any concessions from a seller because they were in such a strong position. But now the market is shifting. It's probably heading towards a more neutral, and it might even get eventually to a buyer's market. So our representing the buyer, our whole negotiation stance has changed. So we need to kind of get our head around that and be thinking about, okay, maybe we can get some of these things agreed to in order to put the transaction together.
Absolutely, and truthfully, all of these inspections are important, and including the termite. Right. They're absolutely all important. And the truth is, I guess depending on market conditions, the seller can pay for any of these reports. I think the important thing to do is to identify and allow the buyer to choose the inspector or the company that will perform these inspections themselves so that they feel comfortable with who is inspecting on their behalf. Now, who pays for that bill is negotiable, right? I may choose to hire XYZ inspection company and ABC termite company because as the buyer, that is my choice. And then again, assuming a different market condition, I can turn around and try to negotiate with the seller to pay for those reports, right? So there's just a proper way to do it all, and to understand though that ultimately, because all of this is really for the benefit of the buyer, it really should be the buyer driving which inspections they conduct, with whom they conduct them with, and the scope of those inspections should be dictated from the buyer, not from the seller. Okay? All right, so just to give you a few other tips as to what are the benefits of obtaining their own, a buyer obtaining their own termite inspection. So just a few tips here. One, if a seller does give you an inspection report, a buyer going out and having their own done, that's a second opinion, right? And a second opinion is always a good thing. It's never a bad thing. They can also ask for an expanded scope, right? Now, in order for any company to do an invasive inspection, they have to get the permission of the seller in order to be able to do that. And there is a specific carve out for termites because they do what is technically considered invasive inspections because they put a probe in to check to see where termites are. But you know, a lot of times you can ask a termite company to come out and they'll check for termites. Some of these companies actually check for rodents and spiders and things like that, right? So many of them are not just exclusive to termites. So a buyer could ask, do you see any signs of like rodents or some areas have problems with like possums and squirrels and things like
critters.
That, right? Critters, right? Right, absolutely. So they can ask for an expanded scope. Right? And then it gives them a better understanding of Section 2 because all of these reports are built into two sections. Section 1 is the infestation and infections that are existed at that moment at the time of inspections. But Section 2 is what may lead to further infestation, right? And that's commonly, like as an example, you know, maybe the water runoff on the side of the house goes towards the house rather than away from the house. And so when a buyer hires their own inspector, not only do they get to see that in the report, but they get to have further dialogue with the person that they hired to look into this and to really give them some direct feedback.
And you know, a lot of times these reports that the buyer chooses to do are a result of maybe red flags that were called out in the TDS or the SPQ, something that the seller volunteered about the condition of the property. And then the other piece of that is, you know, we're required as real estate agents to do an AVID or an agent visual inspection. The AVID just memorializes that we actually did it.
That's right.
So, I mean, when we do our inspections, hopefully we've read through the disclosures that the sellers provided. We do our look around. You have the physical inspection, and all those things taken together can give you some indication as to where the seller or the buyer should go in their inspections, what kind of things they should ask for.
That's right, and that obligation for the AVID is a Berkshire Hathaway Home Services California Properties obligation in our files.
Right. And I don't expect anyone, and the law doesn't expect you to be experts in termites or mold or radon or any of those things, but if we see red flags, we are obligated to bring those to the buyer's attention, and then our role then is to recommend further investigations, and then we're doing what we should do.
Absolutely. And so a few other benefits to a buyer obtaining their own termite inspection is, you know, there's treatment alternatives. Not everybody, if a house has to be tented.
Yeah, that's changed a lot in the
yes,
last few
right?
years.
There are other alternatives. Some people don't want those chemicals flowing around, right? And so maybe a buyer can look at some of those alternatives and choose those alternatives instead of the tenting or whatever a company may be suggesting.
They may be extremely sensitive to some of the chemicals used in those services.
And then, of course, negotiating leverage, right? Being able to compare your report versus the other report, and then possibly subscribe to ongoing maintenance. Actually, build a longer relationship with a particular termite or pest control company for ongoing service of the house that they're purchasing, right? So these are all benefits and why I think buyers should obtain their own inspection, okay?
And just as a caveat to that, if you're in a situation where you are looking at a house for your customer and it's been in a long-term contract with maybe a termite company to do continual service, don't be lulled into that false sense of security. It's just because they've had a service contract that there's no issues, because it seems like more times than not there are issues.
That's a good point. In fact, recently in San Diego, I was consulting with an agent because the seller, in fact, had one of those ongoing maintenance services, and specifically for termites. And they called the same company that was doing the maintenance to come out and inspect for termites.
I bet they didn't find anything.
Which was interesting, right? So they did find some things, but then the buyer subsequently obtained their own, and of course, it was wildly different. And including tenting and things like that. Now, we could argue the point either way, but the point is that there was a dramatic difference between one company's opinion and the other company's opinion. And in that particular case, they had to obtain yet a third inspection to point out and to try to rebut and to try to understand what the scope really was, right?
And again, as an aside to this, when we get multiple inspections, no matter what kind of inspections they are, we have to give them all to the buyer. The buyer gets all inspections that get made, just not the most recent one.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so the next page that's coming onto your screen is going to be the request for repair. So you're probably thinking, okay, so how does this all get handled, right? Because if we're not going to put requests for the termite report into the contract anymore, we're not going to obligate the seller to pay for Section 1 immediately. How do we handle this, right? Well, we handle it in the repairs requested as we would in any other inspections.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
If in your home inspection, it called out for mold and you needed a further mold inspection, you either negotiate with the seller to obtain a report from some reputable company that you ask, or the buyer does it themselves. And then whatever's found in that report, we negotiate it, right? And we ask to have repairs done, or we ask for money in lieu of, or an adjustment in the price. And they've taken this one step further in the repairs requested, because as you can see there's actually a carve out specifically again for termites. Dean, the
termite lobby got
the
that in
termite lobby, I got to tell you, these guys are pretty good, right? And so in there, you get to see, well, we conducted a Section 1 inspection, and we would like the seller to make those corrections. And so you would check that box. You would identify the report that it's dated, and then the company that actually did the inspection. And then you would attach that to this repairs requested, right? And then Section 2, if you're going to ask the seller to take care of Section 2, which typically the sellers don't, typically, the buyer takes on those responsibilities. But if you were to try to get the seller to pay for that, you would then, again, check that box that you see there for Section 2. So that is how you would negotiate termite in today's environment.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Okay? And along with anything else that you may have going on in your repairs requested. Okay? So, in preparing for today's session, I also had the opportunity to speak with our escrow officers. In one in particular, Rachel at the escrow firm in Orange County. Rachel, if you're on, hi, thank you very much for your input yesterday. I really appreciate it. So what a lot of escrow officers have shared with me is that if you write the seller to provide a termite inspection report, then they have to receive some sort of clearance, because especially if there's financing involved, a bank is going to see that in the contract and then request a clearance to be provided.
Right.
Right?
And they have to cover their loan. So.
Yes, they have to do that because it's called out in the purchase agreement. Okay, and so if you're requesting that termite report, despite what we're asking you to do, despite this conversation, just know that there has to be some clearance given somewhere before a lender will fund on this transaction. And I've got to tell you, this is definitely a difficult thing for most escrow officers, because they're doing their hardest to try to work hard for all of you
and be that neutral third
and
party.
Be that neutral third party. And when you call it out in your contract and it gets countered out, or maybe it doesn't get countered out, but they give them the report and they don't, nobody follows through with conducting the work, it creates a problem.
Absolutely.
It creates quite a big problem, actually. And so what they need to know is somebody doing the clearance, who is going to pay for that clearance, right? So have they negotiated that through? Who's going to pay for it? And then the escrow officers have actually asked me, and this is why it's in bold there, you see it on your screen, don't send them your repairs requested. they don't need to see your entire repairs requested. Now, Dean, I know what they're saying, but that's how we handle the whole negotiation of it. You do. That is how you handle it between buyer and seller. The problem with sending the entire repairs requested to escrow is that they will then forward that entire repairs requested over to the lender as well. Okay? And the lender may or may not ask for some of these things to be repaired when you're in fact getting some of these things, money in lieu of repairs. And that can often cause a problem, is what the escrow officer shared with me. So,
a lot of times it happens at the last minute.
That's correct.
Things are coming in at the end, and then all of a sudden the underwriter catches it, and now you have an issue, and you're a couple days away from funding.
Yes. So if this is happening, don't send them the repairs requested. Instead, use, and this is coming directly from our escrow officers, they would prefer that you use some form of an amendment, in specifically the form amendment AEA, the Amendment of Existing Agreement. And just simply add language that says seller to pay for Section 1 termite clearance provided by, and then whatever that termite company is, right? So that way, all the escrow officer has to do is forward that amendment, amending that very specific item as to who's paying for what over to the lender or whoever else in the transaction may be requesting it, okay? So that was an important thing. And then on your next screen that you'll see there, that is an example of that Form AEA. You can also use just a straightforward addendum. Either one is fine. This one seems to be a little bit more straightforward, amending an existing agreement to provide a termite inspection report, right? Okay. And so the next page is what escrow does not need to know, right? So one of them is that if you're not requesting a report in the contract, they don't need to know if you subsequently are provided a report or if the buyer conducted a termite inspection. They don't need to know any of that because there's nothing for them to take action on. It is simply yet another inspection that the buyer has elected to do. Now, if through the repairs requested, and again, this is when the report has not been asked, there has not been a report requested in the RPA, but there is subsequent negotiations because the buyer conducted a termite inspection and they've negotiated it through the repairs requested. Once again, they don't want your repairs requested form. Okay, so they wanted me to really differentiate these two. But there's also no need for an AEA. All that is needed is an invoice that the seller needs to just submit an invoice to pay for something that the seller has agreed to pay, right? So does everybody understand hopefully everybody understands the clarity and the difference between the two. One is if you've requested a report in your RPA, right, then some clearance has to come about.
Right, it's going to have to go throughout the contract.
Absolutely. And then you have to determine who's going to pay for that, that clearance, right?
And you're going to have to memorialize it on a form.
And you have to, so you may handle that through repairs requested, but you need to provide an amendment, right, to escrow so that they will make the proper adjustments for you. They don't need the repairs requested form, okay? Then the other side of this, the other scenario is when you do not ask for a report in the RPA, but the buyer subsequently negotiated the clearance with the seller by way of the repairs requested. Once again, they do not need the request for repairs. They do not need that, nor do they need an amendment as to who's paying for anything because there was no previous obligation or agreement regarding termite. It is simply, if the seller is agreeing to pay, it is simply just an invoice that the seller would say, hey, this is part of my cost and please pay it out of my proceeds, right? So I encourage you to talk to your escrow officer either at Pickford Escrow or the escrow firm because they are all really terrific and they will guide you through this process. And any time that we can organize something or organize our transaction and in anticipation of some of these issues, it just makes for such a smoother transaction. right?
Yeah, and I think the other thing is people, agents, worry about work that was agreed to by the seller not being completed. And once you memorialize it in a request for repairs or an RPA, then it becomes contractual. The seller is contractually obligated to make those repairs. And then there's a whole dispute resolution clause available to us if for some reason it doesn't happen by the close of escrow.
Yep. Okay. And so the last thing I'm going to leave you with before we take any questions is, okay, so despite us saying, please, please, please don't add it into the contract, don't ask for it in the contract, we know that there's going to be some circumstances where maybe you have a buyer or a seller who maybe has done this before and are adamant about requesting a termite inspection, and then maybe subsequently trying to identify who pays for Section 1, right? Because we know that we're sensitive to the fact that there are customers, clients out there that want this to be done this way. And so here is the best practice if you absolutely have to, and only if you absolutely have to, this is what we would prefer. So in Section 7A2 or Section 7A3, either one is fine, that you simply say, seller to pay for the following report. You just say, seller, give us a termite report. Knowing full well and making sure your lender, if there's financing involved, making the lender aware that we are asking for a termite report and we are going to negotiate some sort of clearance, so be ready for that, right? So I'm having that conversation. I'm actually identifying a company that the buyer wants, not seller's choice. The buyer should interview 2 or 3 companies, choose one from there, and then ask the seller to pay for that inspection. Okay, so as you see it on the screen, that is the best practice if you have to put it into the contract.
And if the seller refuses to pay for the inspection, then the buyer should consider paying for that inspection themselves. They need the information. The whole idea about these inspections is to give them good information so they can make a decision whether they go forward and close or not.
And remember, if you choose to do this, especially if there's financing involved, chances are if the seller says, no, I'm not doing any repairs and the price is so good that the buyer can't pass this up, there's a good chance that the buyer may be forced to actually pay for corrective work. That's another thing for you to consider, right?
There's
so, but again,
wrinkles here.
Yeah, only if you absolutely have to do this. Now, to make sure that the seller agrees to pay for that Section 1 in that same contract, you can skip down to 7D8, right? So you should see right below that first section that I was talking about there. That's a more appropriate location to ask the seller to pay for Section 1 termite clearance from AAA fake termite company, whatever that might be, right? Now, there's no cap on there though, right? So if you're representing the buyer, obviously you're not concerned about there being a cap, and you're trying to represent your buyer appropriately, and so you wouldn't put necessarily a cap. But listing agents, when you receive an offer that looks like this, okay, or even previously where they put it all on one line, when you receive that offer, if you're not countering back and deleting that in its entirety, and your seller is agreeing to do some sort of termite work, the best practice, and right there in yellow there at the bottom it says listing agent note, in the counteroffer include the following if this applies: Section 7D8, amount not to exceed, and then whatever that is, or wherever they've called that out, the termite in the contract. Make sure that you put a cap, either the cap of whatever the report that you currently have, or put some arbitrary number that your seller agrees to, so that if a report does come back for $50,000, your seller won't be obligated to follow through with that transaction.
Yeah, and actually, even with the RPA structured the way that it is, it's still possible for us as listing agents to commit the seller to a Section 1 termite clearance in some cases where we don't even have the report yet, so we don't know how much it's going to be. Then you absolutely have to put some caps on, either a cap or the seller's ultimate approval of whatever the report comes in and what the cost is.
Yep. So the moral of the story in all of this is, on the buyer side, the buyer deserves to have all of these inspections, deserves to have all of these reports, but also deserves to choose those people that are conducting these inspections, as they would with physical inspection or anything else, including termite. Okay. And then on the seller side, it's a good practice. It's an important practice for the seller to begin completing a lot of these pre-sale inspections, including termite. Like, as you list the property, before it maybe goes into the MLS, certainly before you receive an offer, it's a good idea to get a termite inspection. I think it's even a good idea to get a physical home inspection. It's a good idea to have the seller scope out the sewer line, right?
Yeah, because as we talked about earlier, as the market changes, and the seller is going to be put in the position of being in a tougher negotiating point, the more information they have, the more realistically they can negotiate the price that they're willing to accept. Because the buyer is going to check these things out, and they are going to find deficiencies. So might as well get them out on the table and find out what it is.
Absolutely. And from a pure negotiating standpoint, I think by coaching the seller through getting a lot of these reports, despite the fact that it's going to cost them some money, my argument is that puts us spending a few bucks for these inspections. In some cases, it could be as much cumulatively $1,000, $1,500, could save you thousands of dollars down the line in negotiations when it comes to repairs requested, because the buyer was made aware of it right from the beginning, at the very least, right? So that's our 2 cents, and
or maybe even 5 cents.
Maybe 5 cents. I don't know. But we'll take some of your questions, and feel free to type them in, whatever you think. Also, as we're getting prepared to read some of those questions, we want to invite you, if you'd like to know more information on this, or you'd like to have a further discussion on this termite situation and best practices for the contract, things like that, talk with your branch manager. And both Dean and myself, the other way around,
that guy,
right? And including Martha, we're all willing to come out to your branches, to your meetings, and have these discussions there. Get into a more intimate conversation with that. Speak to actual circumstances that may be happening in your marketplace, because they all are really different. But ultimately, we just want to help you have smoother transactions, sell more property, and of course help all of our clients manage risk to the best of our ability.
And I also wanted to brag on you a little bit, because Sam has put together videos of different paragraphs in the RPA, and even if you're an experienced agent and you really haven't read that RPA from cover to cover in a while, there's some great material there on MyConnect that you can just click into, and if you're concerned about a particular paragraph or two, you can go through the video on that. Sam explains it very well, and it's just a great resource I think people fail to utilize as much as they could.
Well, thanks so much. Yes, you can find it on MyConnect in the training site, and click on contracts and disclosures. You can also use the search bar in the training portal, type in any section in the RPA. So for example, section 7, and all of the videos that we have regarding section 7 will come up, and then you can watch them. Most of them are really short format. I think there's only a few that are maybe 15 or 20 minutes long, but most of them are really short.
How many are in there, Sam?
There's 35, 37, Sid, right? Something like that. And as you can imagine, because the contract changes twice a year, we're constantly updating those. And admittedly, we do have some updates that are still pending on some of those. But I think the meat of what we see on the contract right now is still very much relevant and covered on all of those videos. So.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking those videos are primarily aimed at the agents and helping them understand it.
That is correct.
I was on the CAR website the other day, and I noticed that they also have some tutorials on there that are actually designed for the consumer.
Yes.
So if you're stuck explaining a particular paragraph or two to your buyer or your seller, they have some nice information on there to help you do that. So.
Yes, and I think that's a great strategy. I mean, being able to share and educate the consumer about what they're signing and what they're looking at, I think is a point of value. Okay, Sid, what kind of questions do we have on there?
So going back to buyer agency,
Okay.
can you address the need to have all the numbers filled in by the buyer agent?
Okay, so going back to the buyer's agency, so the question was, can we address on the new section of the buyer agency the importance of having the buyer's agent fill out all of the appropriate fields in that area. So, and that's a good point, actually. Yeah. So, buyer agent. So, if you're the one filling out the RPA, you're representing the buyer, right? Because that's who initiates this document. Okay, and so it is your obligation to fill this RPA out in its entirety, right? Including this agency confirmation section, which includes having to look up the listing agent's company, the listing agent's name, their license number, all of those things. And I know that can sometimes be painful, especially when you're in a hurry. But it is your obligation as a buyer's agent to fill all of that in, including, I don't have it here, but that last page, the final signature page of the RPA, and all of the company's information, your contact information, and the listing agent's contact information, including the escrow information that was proposed, right? So buyer agents, when it comes to the RPA, you do have more work. It is your obligation to fill all of those things out because somebody at some point has to come back and clean that up. Right. So just take a few extra moments to do it, fill it out in its entirety, and everybody's life will be easier. I'm sure I hear the escrow officer saying, yes, please, please.
Oh, no, and the transaction
and the transaction coordinators too. Lots of love to our transaction coordinators out there.
Absolutely. So, I mean, honestly, it's right there in the listing on the MLS. Yep. You can pull those license numbers off, but it takes an extra step to get them.
Yep, absolutely. Sid, next question?
It's a long one.
Okay.
As a buyer rep, why should I make Section 1 a negotiation when I can make it an obligation through the old method by specifying the buyer's choice of termite company? Why decrease leverage on other items?
Why don't you pull down your mic there, and I just increased the, let's do that one more time, just because that's a long one. All right, go ahead.
As a buyer rep, why should I make Section 1 a negotiation when I can make it an obligation through the old method by specifying the buyer's choice of termite company? Why decrease leverage on other items?
Why decrease leverage on other items? I'll let you take that.
I think as the market continues to change, you might be in a situation where you can call out an actual termite company and inspection and make it contractual. But, I mean, it's whether you negotiate it in the front end. Now, if they don't already have a termite report, I can't think of any seller that's going to sign up with a blank check. So at some point, you're going to have that inspection report to go off of. So I guess the other way of looking at that is if it's in the contract and the listing agent doesn't know what that report is going to give, then they're probably going to counter it right back out again.
Assuming that's a good listing agent.
Well, yeah, and hopefully they do truth, right? Catch it, yeah.
Right, I mean, it is the truth, right? All of us agents, real estate professionals, we're not all created equal,
that's right?
And I hear what you're saying. Being an advocate for your buyer, because I think that's really what the premise of your question really is. But I suppose I would argue that all of the inspections are equally as important. I would even argue that some of these other things are more important than termite, right?
Could
like
be.
Mold and radon and heck, even the physical inspection, like the actual structural integrity of the property. I know that termites can lend to that structural integrity as well, but I think that by leaving it off of the contract and then coming back to it in a repairs requested with literally a gunfire of evidence as to why I either need to reduce the price, have a lot of repairs done, or get credits for that, and then turning all of those inspections over to the seller, who then has an obligation to disclose all of those reports to every subsequent buyer that comes through there. Right. I think puts the buyer in terrific negotiating leverage, because we got to remember that in every transactions, there's 2 rounds of negotiations. Mm-hmm. We all get kind of caught up on the first round, which is the RPA and the price, right? And then the counters back and forth. That's actually round 1. Round 2 is actually in the repairs requested, right?
I really think you can accomplish the same thing that you're trying to accomplish by dealing with it inside the contract, because you can structure a price reduction in lieu of repairs if that's more advantageous to your customer. Sure. So I guess in my thinking, it gives you a little bit more flexibility.
Absolutely, right? And then, again, if you have a client that so chooses, we gave you the best practice as to how to write those into the contracts, right? But let's remember, let's make this a client choice and not necessarily something that that we are advocating on behalf of them, because either that's the way we've always done it, or that was the way it worked out for one particular client versus another client. So I think sometimes we get caught into that.
Yeah, I'd also say be open to it and read that paragraph 12 word for word. I think so many times I talk to agents and they don't even realize that it's in the RPA. Yeah. They know that it got taken out, and so they assume that it's still out.
Yep.
So check that out.
All right. We'll take a couple more questions, Sid.
I think this one's already answered, but I think it's important to reiterate. AEA is only recommended.
Sid, pull your.
It's a test.
Is the AEA only recommended if termite is written into the RPA?
Is the ADA, or do you mean the AEA?
AEA.
Is the only if it's written? The answer is yes. So, well, the AEA is an amendment to an existing agreement, right? So anything really in there that you may have to amend that is already an agreement in place, right? It could be for anything. Yeah. But in this specific instance, if a report is requested, and then in the RPA, and then the buyer reviews that report and either does their own inspection or doesn't do that inspection, and then requests the repairs to be done in the repairs requested form, and there's a negotiation that's settled there. If the seller agrees to do Section 1, then an AEA is how you notify escrow that the seller is going to pay for that report or for that corrective work. Sorry.
Right. It's just a way to memorialize who's paying for what.
Don't send them the repairs requested. This is a request that comes directly from all of your escrow officers. So they would prefer not to receive it, just because it has caused more issues than not, because they subsequently have to forward that document onto other stakeholders in the transaction. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yep.
And we'll take one more.
When writing an offer, do you recommend putting Section 1 termite in RPA or waiting and negotiating in repairs requested?
So the best practice, right, Dean? Why don't you, as we said right from the beginning.
Yeah, the CAR, and there's a lot of brokers that sit on the forms committee, they spend a lot of time, going through these forms, trying to give us tools that afford us the greatest protection, not only for us, but for our clients. So I think the way they designed this form was a way to deal with this issue and several other inspection type issues, and give us a vehicle so that we could get those things done. And I think when you use the flow of the contract itself, it's all been vetted, it's legal, it's well written. It sometimes can make your life a little bit easier, I think.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. It's better to leave it as a buyer inspection, right? So don't ask for the seller to provide that. If they've already conducted an inspection, they'll provide it to you along with the transfer disclosure statement and the SPQ and all the other disclosures that they have to do according to paragraph 14A, which is the seller's requirement to deliver those disclosures within 7 days. So you'll still receive it. So, and the termite inspection reports, I suppose depending on the house, aren't really that expensive.
The reports themselves are very reasonable.
They're typically very reasonable. So I would encourage the buyer to do those inspections themselves, or a request through their own sources to have those inspections done. And then if there's anything that's alarming on there that they want corrected, then to ask for that and the repairs requested, and then go through the process that way. That is what we would prefer you to do as a company. And then secondarily, the last way that we showed you, okay? All right. Well, guys, hey, thanks everybody for being here. Dean, any last parting words?
No, I think we told them everything we possibly could.
Thanks again. I'm going to do my best to go through and answer all of your questions in the chat. I will go back and type in and try to answer your questions for you. I know we didn't get a chance to go through everything. We're already beyond time that we wanted to be on here. So thank you again.
You bet. Thank you. And you know, if you're talking to your office mates and you enjoyed these casts, then please tell them to check it out.
Yeah, please. And a recorded version will be distributed so that everybody can go back and watch this and hold us accountable to what we said.
We'll get some feedback today.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
We'll definitely get some feedback, and we welcome it. We definitely welcome it. We ultimately we're trying to work hard for you to help you mitigate as much risk as possible, and to help represent our buyers and sellers in the best way possible.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Thanks again, everybody.
All right,
have a good
thanks.
one.
Take care.